Hello, and welcome back to Oak Grove. Things probably look pretty much the same as they did during your last visit here, but don't let appearances fool you. Even here, things change more than you might realize. Of course, the biggest change we have around here is in our population. We get new folks moving in every week or so. They seem to like it pretty well here, too. You know, for as long as I've been around, I can't recall any of them moving back out. Of course, it is pretty and quiet and peaceful here. The lawns, the flowers, the trees are all tended to. Nobody has to work or sweat or worry about bills or appointments or such. Here, there's finally enough time at last to just sit back and relax, settle in the shade and the easy company of friends and share stories. And share them we do. You might say it's something of an industry out here. Of course, you realize there are thousands and thousands of lifetimes of tales to be told in this sparse couple of acres. And those stories all get told and retold. This person over here tells a little bit differently from that person over there, and that person over there adds something to it, and this person over here adds something to it, and it changes, and it grows, and it improves. Nothing at all uncommon to hear the same story you heard just a day or two ago, and it's entirely different. Well, it doesn't take too long to figure out that the more stories you hear, the more there are to tell. And the more you tell, the more there are to hear. And that's the wonderful thing about this place. Everybody has got stories they want to share. And everybody wants to be heard. And here, we hear them. Here we listen. I mean, we really listen. No wonder folks like it here so much. Now today, these good folks, myself and a few others you're going to meet shortly, have selected a story to share with you. It's a large story made up of smaller segments. That's part of what it's all about. It's how the smaller stories go together to make up a larger story. Well, I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. I forget you all don't have the same luxury of time that we do. In fact, I've probably rambled on so long already there's not enough time as it is. So if you'll all please come with me, we'll go meet today's first person on the tour. Now, every story has to start somewhere. Some say this one began thousands, or millions, or even billions of years ago. Others say it began in 1633, when Galileo started studying the night sky with his telescope and was arrested by the Inquisition. Now, I'd say it began right here in Paducah, Kentucky, at the turn of the century, with the birth of this gentleman.
Good afternoon. My name is Mr. John Scopes. Despite what you may have heard to the contrary, I'm just your ordinary man. My father was born in England, visited America, found a job as a railroad mechanic, and ended up staying. His work required him to relocate often. One of the places he found himself was right here in Paducah, where he met my mother, where I was born on August 3rd, 1900. My family always thought of Paducah as home, returned here for good in 1922. By that time, I was away at college, but returned home during the summers to visit, earn extra money selling Fords at the local car lot. At that time, I had no idea what I wanted to do with my life. I was just sort of taking whatever classes interested me, assuming my college degree would take care of itself. Luckily, it did, though through no fault of my own. You see, I had somehow taken enough law courses for a degree, but not enough to become a lawyer. But I had taken enough education courses to teach school. So fresh with my teaching certificate in hand, I began sending out applications. Now, at that exact time, Central High School, Dayton, Tennessee, was looking for a new teacher. It seemed the fellow who had coached athletics and taught some science courses there had resigned. I'd been involved in sports and scored highly in the sciences, and Central was getting pretty desperate as the next school year approached. So they offered me the job, and I started in the fall of 1924. Near the end of my first year, the last week of school, the principal took ill, asked me to substitute teach a biology class of his. All I had to do was help the students review for their final exams. Sounded simple enough. I said I'd be glad to. The finals came and went. Most of the kids did pretty well, and that was that, I thought. Well, now that the school year was over, I decided I'd treat myself to a couple days relaxation in Dayton. Maybe swim a little, play some tennis, before heading back to Paducah to sell those Fords. Besides, I was planning on taking a pretty young lady I'd met to a box supper at the church. So there I was, playing tennis, and this young boy calls me over to the fence, tells me some men would like to talk to me over at Robinson's drugstore. Now, Robinson's was just about the busiest place in town. Folks would go there and sit and talk over sodas and ice cream. It was owned by old Doc Robinson, also chairman of the Board of Education. I figured he wanted to talk to me about some unfinished school business, so I stopped the game and I headed over. I got there, ordered myself a soda, saw Doc and some others talking. Among them was a fellow by the name of George Rapelier. Old George was a live wire, always thinking up some scheme or another about how to improve this or that or make money. He came from New York to survey a farm, was bitten by a copperhead, ended up marrying the nurse who tended him, moving to Dayton and managing a bankrupt coal company. He was spontaneous like that. Didn't always make the best choices, but he could be pretty persuasive. I didn't know it when I arrived, but he had just come up with another new scheme.
John, I'm glad you're here. We've been having an argument, and maybe you can help us settle it. I've been telling Doc that nobody can teach biology without also teaching Charles Darwin's theory of evolution.
Well, the biology book the state's been using since 1919 does discuss it.
And that's the book you used?
Well, yes, but only by chance.
Well, then you've been violating the law.
The new Butler Act outlaws teaching evolution in the state of Tennessee.
Yes, but I'm not for certain.
We've just been reading about how the American Civil Liberties Union thinks the Butler Act ignores American freedom of speech.
Restricts the teaching profession.
Puts chains on the human mind.
They say they'll pay all expenses and hire the country's best lawyers to defend any teacher that's willing to be arrested for breaking the Butler Act.
You don't want people telling you what to think, John.
You don't want them telling you what to do.
John, you've got to stand trial.
Now, wait a minute.
It'd only be a local case, John.
No one would even know it happened.
Well, we went around about it, and I started thinking, the Butler Act could be the start of all kinds of problems. I didn't really like the idea of people being told what to think. And if freedom of education were taken away, what might be next? And the best time to stop a problem is when it starts. So I finally agreed.
Tilly, give me the city desk at the Chattanooga News. City desk, this is F.E. Robinson in Dayton, chairman of the school board. And we just arrested a man for teaching evolution.
And that's where it all began. Within days, my picture was in newspapers all over the world. Folks did know what was happening. Everyone was watching. In the end, tried to go back to my life as I'd known it before, but I never could. My family was harassed. My sister, a math teacher right here in Paducah, was fired because she refused to publicly denounce her own brother. I was turned down for college scholarships. I received hateful letters and threatening phone calls and all the worst people had to offer the rest of my life. It was like I had the mark of Cain. What puzzles me most, even today, is that it could have all turned out so differently. If my father hadn't moved to America, if my family hadn't returned to Paducah, if I hadn't become a teacher, if Central hadn't hired me, if I hadn't stayed in Dayton, if I hadn't gone to Robinson's, if I hadn't said yes to the trial. The race is not to the swift, nor the battle to the strong, nor bread to the wise, nor riches to men of understanding, nor favor to men of skill. But time and chance happens to them all. That's from the Bible, the book of Ecclesiastes. Not for time and chance, you probably would have never heard of John T. Scopes, an ordinary man caught up in extraordinary circumstances.
There's an old story, goes something like this. For want of a nail, a shoe was lost. For want of a shoe, a horse was lost. For want of a horse, a battle was lost. And for want of a battle, the war was lost. All because of a horseshoe nail. Now this story tells us how sometimes the tiniest little things can have an enormous impact on the turning of larger events. Things as small as a horseshoe nail. Or maybe something like this. Common barbed wire. Invented in the 1870s, and its impact on America was astounding. Ranchers were suddenly able to keep their cattle from straying, protect them from being rustled, stake out watering holes and streams, and before long, cattle and crops began to flourish. The Great Plains were conquered, boundaries were established, and life wasn't so dangerous anymore. People began to flood in, fan out, and fill up the land, and America grew by leaps and bounds. All because of this, one idea from one person. And that one person's life changed millions of others. Now, another such life belonged to the next person I'd like to introduce you to today. So if you'll all kindly come with me. This lady is known affectionately as the Betsy Ross of Paducah. She designed the first city flag, which bears the likeness of our beloved Chief Paducah. It's the flag that's displayed in all official city functions and all public gatherings. More importantly, she championed the drive to convert the market house downtown into a cultural center. Her name is Sarah Smith Campbell.
It all began with the end of the Civil War. At least a lot of it did. Most folks now think that after the war was over, we all just shook hands, went home, bandaged up our bruises, and lived happily ever after. Well, that's not how it was, and I'll tell you a little secret. Seldom how it ever is. After that war, we had scars all the bandages in the world couldn't mend because it had to do with the way our minds work. You know when you've had a bad fight with someone, then it suddenly ends and you go on thinking of things you should have said or you will say the next time you see them? That's how it was with us. After we'd finally settled down and stopped killing each other, we were still thinking up ways to hurt each other. There's a philosophy folks were arguing over at the time called survival of the fittest. This was an idea that meant that the strong should dominate the weak. That's pretty much the way it was. Everyone was running around trying to get strong and trample over those folks that didn't have as many advantages. Now in the eastern U.S., the older cities were prospering, making the big business owners rich and powerful. And those big business owners were bringing in cheap labor from overseas, making them work long, hard hours for next to nothing, and that forced our local workers out of jobs. Furthermore, those same businessmen were controlling the prices of crops and farming supplies, and that forced the poor Midwestern farmer out of business. After all, they couldn't hope to compete with or even understand the big ways of the East. Those farmers had no schools, couldn't afford an education if they had, so they naturally developed a deep distrust towards the East and their big city folks and their big city ways. To them, cities became associated with everything evil, from atheism to communism, modernism, Eastern money, short skirts, math, science, schools, education, and things like evolution. So it became city against country, religion against science, progressives against conservatives. The North was still bitter with the South, and the South with the North. And then the East started disliking the West, and the West the East, and before you knew it, it seemed like every direction on the compass had something against every other direction. But then, out of it all, a wonderful thing happened. A glorious event called the Chautauqua. That was a traveling show that went from place to place throughout the country, bringing a variety of education and entertainment to all those folks on all those little farms all over. Well, just imagine the excitement when those big Chautauqua wagons would roll into your area. And they'd set up those huge circus tents, while folks within miles and miles would come around to see if they could crowd inside. And there would be singing, and readings from Shakespeare, and verses from the Bible. And a doctor might lecture on health. And a preacher, the likes of Williams, Jennings, Bryans, would come to give voice to the frustration of the farmer. And then it was magic. Everyone was talking and sharing and laughing and crying, and folks were expressing themselves about what they were thinking and feeling. We were communicating. And that big old tent became a living, breathing, singing, dancing world all by itself. And while folks were inside, they felt alive, many of them for the very first time. Then that big old tent would be taken down, and then it'd head off to its next destination. Rest of the year, folks just kind of had to fend for themselves. And I thought what a wonderful thing it would be to have a permanent Chautauqua, a place where people could go and learn about their heritage, enjoy the arts, and communicate. A place where folks could go just to remember what it was to be a human being. Just like the Market House Museum and the theater downtown. Just in case we should ever forget again.
Remember that piece of barbed wire we were discussing earlier? Well, it had one effect I did not mention. It did something that all the evil desperados, savage animals, poisonous reptiles, blizzards, droughts, and storms could never do. You see, it was the cowboy who tended and looked after those cattle, and now they were safe, and his work was done. We began seeing less and less of him and figured he'd finally ridden off one final time into the sunset. Now, it was shortly after that a man named Buffalo Bill put together a little act called the Wild West Show. It was widely popular, toured the world, even passed through Paducah a couple times or two. I doubt if there's anyone around now who could remember the last time it came through town. That was in 1901. But if there were, they'd tell you how it all happened over on 17th and Harrison Street. Now, those folks that were there would tell you how honest-to-goodness cowboys were seen riding, standing up in the saddle, underneath, upside down, picking guns up off the ground with their teeth, shooting at targets blindfolded from those horses at a full gallop. Those folks that were there would also tell you how they saw an authentic old Indian chief named Iron Tail and an enormous coal-black buffalo as bigger than any cow they'd ever heard of. You should have been there to see it for yourself, they'd have said. It's a shame you couldn't have seen it. But you can, anytime you want to. All you have to do is find yourself one of these, a buffalo nickel, minted by the United States government in 1913 to commemorate the sad passing of these two vanishing breeds. One side has a likeness of the mighty Chief Iron Tail, the other side has that enormous old coal-black buffalo. Cowboys, Indians, buffaloes, the only things that truly die are the things that are forgotten. Old times, old events, people, places, they live on forever, as long as there's somebody around to remember them. Here, we tell stories. If you'll all kindly come with me, please. This man became a lawyer at an unusually early age. He graduated law school at 17. The state had to pass a special provision declaring him of age so that he could set up his law practice before his friends were even out of high school. He was a lawyer here in Paducah for 52 years and a U.S. congressman for 6. His name is Charles K. Wheeler.
The law is a funny thing. From a very early age, I knew I wanted to devote my life to the study of it. When I came to Paducah in 1880 to start my law practice, I had very little money. Only enough, in fact, to rent either a room in a boarding house or an office. I took the office and I slept on my desk for months. It meant that much to me. We've always had the law. Back in the Stone Age, if Caveman Grog saw that Caveman Arg had a brand new bearskin, he might just walk over, thump Arg on the skull with a club and take it. Poor Arg couldn't do anything about it. Whoever was meaner or had the bigger club won. Well, eventually people began planting crops and settling down into villages and found they had to get along. So each village formed a group called a tribunal to outline how everyone should behave. And these little villages got bigger and bigger and started fighting other villages, and before they knew it, they were back to the same old problem. Whichever village was meaner or had the bigger clubs won. Then Rome came along and conquered nearly the whole world. And they had so many rules and regulations, they decided to write them all down in a book to keep up with them. And that book got bigger and bigger, and before they knew it, they had to figure out what to do with all the criminals they were accumulating. What they came up with was something called the Colosseum. This was a huge arena where they would allow a person found guilty of a crime to either be fed to wild animals or to fight to the death with another criminal. Most would choose to fight, and whoever was meaner or had the bigger club won. And whoever did win was allowed to live and to fight again and again until they finally lost. But while they were winning, the crowds loved them. Consequently, any criminal might become a very popular sports hero. Today, it seems, sometimes things work out the other way around. Well, Rome finally fell, and folks decided to try a new system of justice called trial by ordeal. This meant that a person's guilt or innocence could be determined by a test. In the Old Testament, a person accused of a crime was made to drink poison. If they didn't die, they were innocent. In later years, they were made to stick their arm in a vat of boiling lead. If the skin didn't burn off their arm, they were innocent. Well, someone did finally mention how strange it was that no one ever passed any of these tests. Of course, that person was accused of treason and beheaded when he pulled his charred arm from the lead vat. Then William the Conqueror came along and took over England and came up with trial by combat, where the accuser would simply fight it out with the accused, and whoever was right would supposedly win. But this made the poor weak folk think awfully hard about ever complaining about anything in the first place. But then again, if you weren't a good fighter, you could hire someone to fight for you, and whoever was meaner or had the bigger club won. Today, things are different. Today, we have a very elaborate system of justice with courts and judges, and everyone is entitled to a fair trial by a jury of their peers. We've come many, many miles from those first tribunals. Unfortunately, today, legal proceedings can become such spectacles that their true importance is forgotten. Such was the case of Mr. John Scopes and the Great Monkey Trial. And I mean to tell you that during the hearings, the streets outside the courthouse literally became a circus.
Step right this way. Folks, see a real live chimp, only 10 cents.
Come one, come all, to Ringling Brothers' world famous troupe of performing apes.
And folks were standing on the corners, shouting to whoever would listen.
You should know the Rock of Ages instead of the Age of Rocks.
And people were getting into fights.
Your old man's a monkey.
And some were selling evolution magazines and ape dolls and photos. And soda shops made up new drinks and stores ran special promotions.
Darwin is right. Inside, J.R. Darwin's everything to wear. Finest monkey suits available.
Today, ridiculous laws get proposed and sometimes passed that should have never even been considered. Fortunately, John Washington Butler never got any other acts passed. Soon after he got his Butler Act passed, in 1925, he was already hard at work at another law that would outlaw all gossip in Tennessee. What a stir that would have caused. The state of Indiana even once passed a law that changed basic geometry. For those familiar with math, they decided the notation pi was too confusing as 3.141599265 and should just equal an even 4. I'm sure that made for some confusing homework. Today, laws that should be passed never are. And unfortunately, good laws are abused and ignored, and all too often, the more money a person has, the more expensive lawyers they can hire, the better their chances of winning. Still today, whoever is meaner or has the bigger club wins. That is the law. It always has been. I've spent my life trying to figure out how to break it.
In preparing for today's presentation, I thought it might be interesting to look up some of the earlier laws in Paducah. So I took myself down to the public library late one night. It's quieter then, to the place where they keep the local history, newspaper articles, old record books, things such as that. Now, for those of you who have never been there, it's a tiny little room up on the second floor. That's also the place where they keep all my books locked up. Won't let them be checked out. They have to be read on the premises. I guess by people who, like myself, have nothing but time on their hands. Well, anyway, this is what I found. In 1900, it was illegal for a taxi cab driver to charge more than 25 cents to take a fare anywhere in the city limits of Paducah. It was illegal for children to be out on the streets or in any public place after 8 or 9 o'clock at night unless they were accompanied by an adult or had a permission slip. It was illegal to ride bicycles on the sidewalks, fly kites in the city streets, throw rocks, rubber balls, or confetti, or spread talcum powder or flour. And it was strictly illegal for goats to run loose in the city streets. Well, I began asking myself, what kind of picture does that paint for you all of the turn of the century Paducah? Well, folks thought cab rides cost too much. Kids like to stay out late, ride their bikes, fly kites, and throw things, and there seemed to be an overabundance of goats. Then I began thinking, how does that relate to modern-day Paducah? Well, some folks still think cab fare is highway robbery. Kids still like to stay out late, ride their bikes, fly an occasional kite, and throw things. Although the spreading of talcum powder and flour seems to have fallen out of favor. Now, what about all those old goats? We still got plenty of them, except now they're all married and got respectable jobs, so they're pretty much left alone. My conclusions? Folks are folks. Our times change, our attitudes change, our ideals, our beliefs, our laws all change. But we're still people. Now, if you'd all come with me, please, we'll go meet the last person on today's tour. This man was a well-known mortician in Paducah. He operated Hammock's Funeral Home from 1915 to his own death in 1949. Shortly after the events involving Mr. John Scopes down in Dayton, Tennessee, this gentleman took part in an experiment that gained worldwide fame. His name is A.Z. Hammock.
I knew old Charlie Atkins way back. He was a drifter for a long time. Something drew him to Paducah in the early 1920s, and he found a job waiting for him over at the Dixon Tobacco Company. Well, he fit right in. Pretty soon, folks started calling him Speedy. Some will tell you that it was because he was a fast worker over at the tobacco factory. Others say he was fast at washing cars or some such things. Well, the truth is, he was fast on his feet. He had to be. You see, old Speedy liked the ladies, and the ladies liked him back. And sometimes this got him in predicaments where he had to just be able to flat out run, if you see what I mean. He never cared for all that running around, though. He was quiet and kept to himself. And he preferred to sit alone and fish and sip a little moonshine to most anything else. One day in May, a lot like this one, back in 1928, he was struck with the urge to row out in the river with his pole and his jug. And there he was sitting to himself out near Owens Island, a-sipping and a-fishing. I reckon the weather was extra comfortable and warm that day. That old boat rocked slowly, back and forth. And that old homebrew began to take its effect. And everything was just right. And old Speedy fell asleep. I reckon he sort of leaned over and slid right down into the river. Well, some of the folks I knew that day found his body and brought it over to my funeral home. And in those days, we had to keep a body around for a few days until the family was able to raise enough money to have it buried. After all, no one ever heard of Speedy having any kind of a family. And if he did, there was no telling when they show up, if they ever did. So I decided to use a special embalming fluid that I'd been working on to see if I can keep him around a little longer. It turned out that fluid worked better than I'd ever hoped. Months passed, and there he stood over at the funeral home, looking as good as he did the day he slid in the river. No family ever did turn up to claim him, and we gotten pretty attached to him by then. After all, he didn't eat much. He was quiet and minded his own business and never had a mean word to say about anybody. He was just about the perfect guest. And I couldn't think of too many other folk I could say that about. Well, we decided to keep him around a little while longer. And we couldn't imagine him being anywhere else. Oh, I had offers, lots of money for him, from carnivals and sideshows and such.
Step right this way, ladies and gentlemen. Take a peek at the incredible elephant lady. He walks, he breathes, he barks. It's Bobo, the dog-faced boy.
Half man, half alligator. Watch your legs, folks.
Tattoos on every inch of her body.
Speedy, the amazing petrified mummy man.
He wasn't meant for that, and he wouldn't be happy there. And I told all those folks that wanted to buy him, I said, slavery's over, and we don't sell people at Hammock's funeral home. And we didn't. Well, years passed, and more people started coming to see him. The closest thing that came to taking him away was that great flood in 1937. Those waters rose up so fast that people didn't have a chance to do anything. Before half of the buildings in town were half underwater. And those waters rolled up, washed Speedy right out the door and down the streets. And we thought we'd never see him again until some nice folks down there found him floating around out there somewhere and brought him back a few days later. And you know, he never had a word of complaint about the whole experience. Well, years passed, and more people started coming to see him. Pretty soon, folk was dropping by nearly every day. They were taking pictures, writing letters, and calling, and even filming him for television. And he turned out to be pretty famous. Well, I think that's what was meant to happen. I think the Lord has a plan drawn out for all of us. And his plan for Speedy was for him to find his way to Paducah and to go out fishing on that May afternoon and spend the next 66 years touching the lives of thousands of people. I think the Lord has a plan, has a purpose for us all. And his purpose for Speedy was to spend a few more years after death. Some folks may think by him staying around that he was doing penance for some mischief he'd gotten into during his life. But I believe that he hadn't yet done what he was sent here to do. And when you saw the effect that he had on people, you would know that was true. Seemed like whoever would come to see him would always find something in him important that they were looking for. To some folk, he reminded them of a person who rose from not having nothing to becoming a celebrity all over the world. To some others, he represented the black man who couldn't be killed. Still others saw him as a simple, peaceful soul who took all the world in stride. He was different things to different folk. I guess that's why so many people liked him so much. Me? I knew old Charlie Atkins way back. To me, he was a man that found more life out of death than life gave him at birth.
Now, if you all had been hanging out around here as long as I have and heard all these stories as many times as I have, you'd find they all share things in common, just like people all share things in common. And if you took all those things and put them together, you'd find they make a much larger, untold story that has to do with understanding our world just a little bit better. And those stories are always the best of all. Well, perhaps I shouldn't be revealing the secrets of the trade to you all, but you'll find out for yourself in any case. For now, just remember some of the folks you've met today or one thing you've heard, and please pass the story on. I want to thank you all for coming out here today, and I hope you've enjoyed your visit as much as we have. Until next time, if you ever find yourself walking alone out here and you think you hear a brief word on a breeze or a conversation in a rustle of leaves, it just might be a whisper of a story, antique fable, or fairy tale. Next time, listen. I mean, really listen, and you just might be able to make it out. I thank you for your time today. Good day.